They called her a traitor for feeding 3 starving men, and by sunrise, even the wind seemed to stand still around her land. The town of Dry Creek sat quiet under a pale stretch of sky, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears until you started hearing things that weren't there. And at the far edge of that town, past the last split-rail fence and a mile of dry grass that whispered with every breeze, Margaret Hale stood alone on her porch, one hand resting on the weathered post her husband had carved 15 years before the fever took him, her eyes fixed on the road that no longer brought visitors, because word had spread fast in a place like this. Word that the widow fed those she wasn't supposed to. Word that she didn't know her place anymore. And in Dry Creek, that was worse than being poor, worse than being alone. It made you something people watched from a distance, something they spoke about in low voices over coffee and dust, something they didn't help when trouble came. The sun hung low, casting long gold shadows across her fields that hadn't seen a proper harvest in 2 seasons. The soil cracked like old leather, the fence leaning just enough to show time had its way with everything out here, and still she stayed. Because leaving meant giving up the last piece of her husband's name, and Margaret Hale had never been the kind of woman to walk away from what was hers, even if all she had left was a few acres of stubborn land and a silence that followed her from room to room. She heard them before she saw them, not loud, not fast, just the slow, uneven rhythm of hooves dragging through dirt like the horses themselves were thinking twice about every step. And when they finally came into view over the rise, 3 figures against the fading light, she didn't reach for a weapon, didn't call out, didn't even move. She just watched, because out here you learned to read a man before you spoke to him. And these men, these riders, were not the kind that came looking for trouble, not in the shape they were in, their shoulders slumped, their clothes carrying the dust of miles, their horses thin and tired, and even from 30 yards out, Margaret could see it in the way they held themselves, not proud, not threatening, just worn down by something bigger than the road behind them. The first rider lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes scanning the land, not with suspicion, but with the quiet calculation of someone who had learned how to survive by knowing when to ask and when to keep moving. And for a moment, just a moment, their eyes met, and Margaret felt that strange pull she couldn't quite name, not fear, not pity, something steadier, something older than either of those, like a memory that didn't belong to her, but still felt familiar. The town had warned her about this, about men like them, about what it meant to open your door when the world told you to keep it shut. Sheriff Elias had stood right there at the edge of her property 2 days before, his boots clean, his voice measured, telling her plain and simple that anyone offering help to Apache riders would be seen as siding against the town, against the law, against her own people, and Margaret had listened, had nodded even, because she understood the way things worked. She understood the lines people drew in the dust to make sense of a world that didn't always make sense back. But standing there now, watching those 3 riders barely keep themselves upright in the saddle, those lines didn't look as solid as they once had. They looked thin, fragile, like something that could disappear with a single step across them. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of horse sweat, dry leather, and something else. Hunger, the kind that didn't need words to explain itself. And Margaret's fingers tightened slightly against the porch post, her mind moving through every warning she'd been given, every look the townsfolk had thrown her way, every quiet door that had closed when she passed. And still, beneath all of that, one simple thought rose above the rest, clear and steady as the horizon in front of her. They were hungry. One of the riders swayed in his seat, just enough to show how close he was to falling. And that was all it took. No speech, no grand decision. Just a small shift in her chest, the kind that didn't ask permission, and Margaret Hale stepped down from her porch, boots hitting the dust with a soft, certain sound, and started walking toward the road, toward the 3 men the town had already decided she should turn away, toward a choice that, whether she knew it or not, had already begun to change everything. Margaret stopped 10 feet from the riders, close enough now to see the fine layer of dust caked along their sleeves, the dry cracks at the corners of their lips, the way their hands rested loosely on the reins not from ease but from a lack of strength to hold them tighter, and for a moment none of them spoke, the air settling between them like something that needed to be respected before it could be broken. the first rider studying her not with suspicion, but with a quiet patience that suggested he had already accepted whatever answer she might give, and that acceptance, more than anything, made Margaret feel the weight of the choice in front of her. "You have come a long way," she said finally, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach them without sounding like a challenge, and the man gave a small nod, the motion slow, measured, as if even that took effort. "Miles do not matter when the body is empty," he replied, his English careful but clear, and there was no accusation in it, no request either, just a statement placed between them like a stone that could not be ignored. Margaret glanced briefly toward the distant line of the town, barely visible through the heat and dust, and she could almost hear the echo of Sheriff Elias Crow's voice, firm, certain, telling her where the lines were drawn and what crossing them would cost. And she knew he would not come riding out here himself, not unless there was trouble to be claimed. But word had a way of traveling faster than horses in a place like Dry Creek, and by sundown, if anyone saw what she was about to do, it would no longer be her land alone. It would be a statement, a decision that others would not let pass quietly. The second rider shifted slightly, his hand tightening on the saddle horn, and Margaret noticed how his eyes moved, not scanning for danger, but searching, as if measuring the distance between survival and something just out of reach. And she followed that look without thinking, back toward her house, toward the small wooden door that had not been closed to a stranger in years, and the thought came again, simple, persistent, they were hungry. There was no ceremony in what she did next, no pause for approval. She simply turned and walked back toward the porch, the boards creaking softly under her boots as she climbed the steps, and for a heartbeat she wondered if they would follow. If they would trust a door that belonged to someone they had no reason to believe in. But when she reached for the handle and pushed it open, she heard it behind her, the slow, careful movement of horses stepping forward, not rushing, not pressing, just accepting the space she had offered. Inside, the house held the quiet of years, the faint scent of dried herbs hanging near the window, the worn table set close to the stove, and Margaret moved without hesitation, reaching for the last of the bread she had baked 2 days before, still wrapped in cloth to keep it from going hard, and she paused only once, her hand resting on it, aware that this was not extra, not something she could easily replace. This was what she had counted on to carry her through the next week, and outside. The soft sound of hooves stopped just short of her door. When she stepped back onto the porch, the riders had dismounted, their movements deliberate, respectful, none of them crossing the threshold without invitation, and Margaret held out the bread without a word, the gesture simple enough that it did not need explaining, and for a second, the first rider did not take it, his eyes meeting hers again, searching for something deeper than the offer itself, and then he reached forward, accepting it with both hands, not like a man taking food, but like someone receiving something that carried weight beyond its shape. "You should not do this," the third rider said quietly, his voice lower, edged with something that sounded like warning more than gratitude, and Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "I am not doing it for you," she answered, and there was no harshness in her tone, only a calm truth that settled into the space between them. "I am doing it because you need it." The words lingered, and for the first time, something shifted in their expressions, not surprise, not relief, something quieter, something that did not ask for more. And as they broke the bread, sharing it between them in measured pieces, Margaret stepped aside, leaving the doorway open, not as an invitation spoken aloud, but as a choice made visible, and beyond them, the road stretched back toward a town that had already decided what kind of woman she was, a town that would not understand the silence now settling over her porch, the kind of silence that came when a line had been crossed, not with defiance, but with something far more difficult to undo. They ate slowly, not because they wished to, but because their bodies no longer remembered how to rush. Each bite measured, each swallow careful, as if taking too much too fast might break something inside them that had already been stretched thin by too many miles and too little rest, and Margaret watched from the doorway without stepping closer, giving them the space that hunger demanded, the kind of space that did not crowd or question, just existed quietly until it was no longer needed. The sun dipped lower, pulling long shadows across the yard, and the dry grass shifted in soft waves under the evening wind, carrying with it the faint creak of her barn door swinging on its hinge, a sound she had grown used to in the years since no one had been around to fix it properly. And still, none of the riders moved toward the house. None of them crossed the invisible line between being given something and taking more than was offered. When the bread was gone, the first rider brushed the crumbs from his hands, slow and deliberate, then reached into the small pouch tied at his side, his fingers moving with care as he pulled something free, something small enough to disappear in his palm, and for a moment he held it there, as if weighing not the object itself, but the meaning of leaving it behind. Margaret noticed the others glance toward him, not with surprise, but with a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that passed between men who understood without speaking, and then he stepped forward just one pace, extending his hand toward her without stepping onto the porch, respecting the space she had not yet invited him to cross. "For you," he said, his voice low, steady, and Margaret hesitated only briefly before reaching out to take it, her fingers brushing against his for the shortest moment. And what he placed in her hand was lighter than she expected, a small piece of leather wrapped around a bit of turquoise stone, worn smooth from time, the color dulled, but still holding a trace of something that caught the last light of the day. "It is nothing," the second rider added, though his tone suggested otherwise, "just a sign that we remember," and Margaret turned the object slightly between her fingers, not understanding its full meaning, but sensing the weight behind it, the kind that did not come from the thing itself, but from the hands that had carried it and the road it had traveled. "You do not have to leave anything," she said quietly, her eyes lifting back to the first rider, and he gave a faint shake of his head, not in refusal, but in correction. "Some things are not payment," he replied, "they are promises." The words settled into her thoughts, unfamiliar in this context, and before she could ask what kind of promise could be carried in something so small, the third rider stepped back toward his horse, his movements a little steadier now, the food having given him just enough strength to stand without leaning, and one by one, they began to gather themselves, adjusting reins, checking straps, preparing to leave in the same quiet way they had arrived. "You should close your door tonight," the third rider said again, but this time there was something different in his voice, not warning of them, but of something else, something not yet visible, but already moving toward her, and Margaret felt a slight tightening in her chest, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that came when the air shifted just enough to signal a change you could not yet see. "I have closed it before," she answered, and the first rider looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring that statement against something deeper, then nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than words, and without another sound, they mounted their horses, turning them slowly back toward the open land, their figures already beginning to fade into the stretch of gold and shadow as the sun dropped lower behind the ridge. Margaret remained where she was, the small leather piece resting in her palm, her eyes following them until they became no more than shapes against the horizon, and even then, she did not move right away, because something about the way they had left, the way they had spoken, did not feel finished. It felt like the beginning of something she could not yet name. When she finally stepped back inside, the house seemed quieter than before, as if it too had noticed the change, and she placed the small token on the table near the window, where the last light of the day caught it just enough to make the turquoise flicker faintly, and for reasons she could not explain, Margaret did not put it away, did not hide it. She left it there, visible, as if some part of her understood that whatever promise had been placed in her hand had not yet come due, and that, when it did, it would not knock politely before arriving. Night settled over the land the way it always did out here, slow and heavy, pressing the last warmth out of the dirt until the air carried a chill that slipped through cracks in wood and bone alike. And Margaret sat by the small window with the oil lamp turned low, its flame steady but dim, casting long shadows that stretched across the table where the piece of turquoise rested, quiet and unmoving, yet somehow louder than anything else in the room. She had seen objects before, gifts, tokens, things left behind by passing hands that meant little once the dust settled. But this one did not fade into the background. It held its place, catching her eye again and again as if it refused to be forgotten, and each time she looked at it, she heard the words again, not payment, a promise, spoken without force, without demand, yet firm enough to stay. Outside, the wind shifted direction, brushing against the side of the house with a soft, persistent sound, and somewhere near the barn, a loose board tapped against its frame, uneven, irregular, like a heartbeat that did not quite know its rhythm. And Margaret rose from her chair, not in alarm, but in habit, her steps slow, measured, crossing the room toward the door as she reached for her coat, the same worn one she had used through winters that tested more than just the cold. When she stepped onto the porch, the night air met her with that familiar dryness, the scent of dust and open land stretching miles in every direction, and she paused there, her eyes scanning the dark horizon, not expecting to see anything, but unable to ignore the feeling that something had shifted beyond what sight could confirm. The road lay empty, the same narrow line cutting through the land, untouched since the riders had vanished into it. And yet the silence did not feel complete. It carried a tension, thin but present, like the moment before a storm when the sky still looks clear, but the air says otherwise. Margaret stepped down from the porch, her boots pressing into the cool dirt, each step quiet, deliberate, and she walked toward the edge of her yard, stopping just short of the fence where the land opened wide. And she stood there for a long moment, listening, not for sound, but for absence, for anything that broke the pattern she had come to know so well over the years. And then she noticed it, not a noise, not movement, but the lack of both. The way the usual night sounds seemed to hold back, as if the land itself was waiting. She turned slightly, glancing back toward the house, the faint glow of the lamp still visible through the window, illuminating the table where the turquoise piece remained. And for a brief second, she considered going back inside, closing the door, letting the night pass as it always had. But the memory of the third rider's voice returned, "You should close your door tonight." And it did not feel like advice anymore. It felt like something placed ahead of her, something she had already stepped into without realizing it. Margaret took a slow breath, the air cool in her lungs, and instead of retreating, she moved along the fence line, her hand brushing lightly against the wood as she walked, grounding herself in something solid, something known. And when she reached the far corner of the yard, she stopped again, her gaze lifting toward the distant ridge where the last trace of twilight had long since disappeared, leaving only a dark line against the sky. For a moment, there was nothing, and then, just barely, something changed, not enough to see clearly, but enough to feel, a presence at the edge of distance, too far to define, too steady to dismiss. And Margaret stood still, her body quiet, her mind narrowing to that single point on the horizon. And though she could not yet make out shapes or numbers, she knew with a certainty that did not need proof that whatever had been set in motion that afternoon had not ended with the rider's departure. The wind carried across the land once more, softer now, almost careful, and Margaret turned back toward the house, not hurried, not afraid, but aware in a way she had not been before. And as she stepped onto the porch again, her hand resting briefly on the door before pushing it open, she understood something simple and unspoken. The night was not empty. It was arriving. Morning did not arrive with birds or light the way it usually did. It came quietly, almost carefully, like something stepping onto land that did not belong to it. And Margaret was already awake before the first line of pale gray touched the horizon, sitting at the edge of her bed with her boots in her hands, listening to a silence that felt heavier than the night before, not empty, but held, as if the world outside her walls had paused without asking permission. She moved slowly, pulling on her coat, stepping into her boots, and as she crossed the room, her eyes fell once more on the small piece of turquoise resting on the table, still where she had left it, catching the faintest hint of early light. And for a moment, she reached for it, her fingers hovering just above its surface before she stopped, not out of hesitation, but because something told her it was not meant to be carried. Not yet. It was meant to remain where it could be seen. The floor creaked softly beneath her steps as she made her way to the door, her hand settling on the handle, and she paused there, not in fear, but in recognition, because whatever had been building through the night had reached its edge, and stepping outside would not reveal something new. It would reveal something that had already arrived. When she opened the door, the air met her cool and still, the kind of stillness that pressed against sound and held it back. And she stepped onto the porch, her gaze lifting instinctively toward the horizon, expecting the same open stretch of land she had known for years, the same quiet road, the same distant ridge, But what she saw instead made her stop before her second step touched the wood. They were there, not close, not pressing in, but spread across the land in a wide arc that curved around her property like a line drawn with intention. Figures on horseback standing in complete stillness, their silhouettes dark against the rising light. And for a moment, her mind did not count them, did not try to measure the number, because it did not need to. The scale of it was already clear, far beyond the 3 riders from the day before, far beyond anything Dry Creek had ever seen. Gathered in one place without noise or force. They did not move, not one of them, no shifting of reins, no restless horses, just a quiet presence that filled the space from one end of her land to the other. And Margaret stood there, her hand resting lightly against the porch post, her breathing steady, her eyes moving slowly across the line, taking in the stillness, the discipline, the absence of threat in something that could have easily felt overwhelming. The light grew stronger, spreading across the fields, touching the edges of the riders, revealing more detail with each passing second, the patterns of their clothing, the shapes of their faces, the quiet focus in the way they held themselves, not watching her as prey, not watching her as a target, but as something else entirely, something that had drawn them here without needing to be called. Behind her, the house remained unchanged, the same worn boards, the same small window, the same table holding a single piece of turquoise that now seemed less like an object and more like a signal she had not known how to read. And as the realization settled, Margaret understood that the promise she had been given the night before had not been delayed. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. A faint sound carried across the distance then, not loud, not sharp, just the soft rhythm of a single horse stepping forward from the line, and Margaret's eyes followed it, finding the rider as he moved toward the center of her land, his pace slow, deliberate, and even before he came close enough to be seen clearly, there was something in the way he carried himself that marked him as different from the others, not above them, but held by a weight they all recognized. He stopped at a respectful distance, far enough to leave space, close enough to be heard without raising his voice, and when he spoke, his words carried across the quiet morning air with a calm that did not need force to be understood. "You kept your door open," he said, and Margaret did not answer right away, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, because the truth of that statement did not require defense, it simply existed between them. The man inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than authority, and for a brief moment, the entire line behind him seemed to settle even further, as if his presence confirmed what had already been decided. And Margaret felt it then, not fear, not relief, something deeper, something that came when a choice made in quiet had reached far beyond its place of origin and returned not as consequence, but as something that stood beside it. She stepped down from the porch, her boots touching the dirt with the same steady rhythm as the day before, and though the land in front of her now held more people than she had seen in years, the path she walked felt no different, because whatever had brought them here had begun with something small, something simple, something that did not ask permission before becoming something more. The man who had stepped forward did not reach for anything, did not raise his voice, did not even close the distance between them, and yet the space around him carried a weight that made the morning feel sharper, clearer, as if every small movement now mattered more than it had a moment ago. And Margaret stopped a few paces from him, the dry earth steady beneath her boots, her hands resting at her sides, not open, not closed, simply present, the way a person stands when they have nothing to hide and nothing to prove. "You fed them without asking who they were," he said, his tone even, not questioning, not accusing, just placing the truth between them, and Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. "They were hungry," she replied, the same words she had spoken before, but now they carried further, moving across the quiet line of riders behind him, settling into the stillness that had brought them all here. The man studied her for a moment, not long, but long enough to show that he was listening for something beyond the words, something that could not be shaped or rehearsed, and whatever he found seemed to settle something in him, because he gave a small nod, not as a command, but as recognition, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, one that reached beyond the space between them and into the line behind him. "They rode through the night," he said, "not to escape, but to carry a message, and many would not have listened. Many would have turned them away before the first word was spoken, and Margaret felt a faint shift in her chest, not surprise, but understanding, the kind that comes when a piece of something larger begins to fall into place without needing to be explained in full. The turquoise you hold, he continued, his eyes flicking briefly toward the house behind her, was given so that we would know where they had been seen, where they had been received, and Margaret followed that glance for the briefest moment, her thoughts returning to the small piece resting on her table, no longer just an object, but a mark, a signal that had traveled faster than she could have imagined. "We do not forget such things," the man said, and there was no emphasis in his tone, no attempt to make the words larger than they were, because they did not need it. They stood on their own, steady and certain, and behind him, the line of riders remained unmoving, their presence now less like a gathering and more like a decision already made. Margaret drew a slow breath, the morning air cool in her lungs, and for the first time since stepping outside, she let her gaze move past the man in front of her, across the wide arc of riders that surrounded her land, taking in the scale of it without flinching, without stepping back, because something in the way they stood, in the way they held themselves, made it clear that this was not a threat, not a show of force meant to press in, but something else entirely, something quieter and far more deliberate. "The town will see this," she said after a moment, her voice calm, not worried, not hopeful, just stating what would come, and the man inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging a truth that had already been considered. "They will," he answered, "and they will decide what they believe it means, but what it is does not change with their belief." The words settled into the space between them, and Margaret felt the weight of them in a way that did not press down, but steadied, like a hand placed gently on something that might otherwise drift, and for a brief moment, the memory of Sheriff Elias returned, his warnings, his certainty, the lines he had drawn so clearly, and she realized that those lines no longer held the same shape they once had, not because they had been broken, but because something larger had stepped across them without asking permission. The man shifted slightly in his saddle, not to leave, but to settle, and when he spoke again, his voice softened just enough to carry something more personal. "They will not trouble you today," he said, and the statement did not sound like a promise made lightly. It sounded like something already decided, already in place, and Margaret nodded once, not in gratitude, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The same quiet exchange that had passed between her and the riders the day before, the kind that did not require more than a single motion to be understood. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the morning stretching out around them, the light growing stronger, revealing more of what had already arrived, and then Margaret turned slightly, her gaze moving back toward the house, toward the small table by the window, and without a word, she began to walk back toward it, her steps steady, unhurried, as if the presence behind her did not need to be watched to be trusted. And as she reached the porch and stepped inside, the door left open behind her. The line of riders remained exactly as they were, not advancing, not retreating, simply holding their place, as if the land itself had decided to stand still for her. Margaret did not close the door behind her. She left it as it was, open to the morning, open to the quiet weight that had settled across her land, and as she stepped toward the table, her eyes fell again on the small piece of turquoise, its surface catching the growing light in a way that felt different now, no longer just a reflection, but a signal fulfilled, something that had already done its work before she ever understood it. She reached down and picked it up this time, her fingers wrapping around the worn leather, and for a moment she simply held it there, feeling its shape, its edges, as if the truth of it might reveal itself through touch alone, and outside, the stillness remained unbroken, the riders holding their line with a patience that did not waver. From beyond the far end of her property, another sound began to rise, faint at first, then clearer, the familiar rhythm of horses moving with purpose, not slow, not tired, but driven by something more urgent, and Margaret lifted her head slightly, listening, recognizing that sound long before she saw its source, because it carried with it something she had known for years, the sound of men who believed they were right. She stepped back toward the doorway, the turquoise still in her hand, and when she reached the porch again, the horizon had changed, not with the quiet presence that had arrived before, but with motion, a small group of riders approaching from the direction of Dry Creek, their figures sharper, their pace steady, and at their front, unmistakable even at a distance, was Sheriff Elias Crow. He did not slow as he reached the edge of her land, but the men behind him did, their horses shifting uneasily as they took in the sight before them. The wide arc of Apache riders standing silent, unmoving, not advancing, not retreating, and for a moment, the sheriff remained alone in his forward motion, riding a few yards ahead before pulling his horse to a stop, his posture straight, his gaze fixed not on Margaret, but on the man who had stepped forward earlier, the one who now sat waiting in the same place, unchanged, as if time itself had not touched him. No one spoke at first, and the silence stretched between the two sides, not tense, not sharp, but heavy, filled with something that did not need to be named to be understood, and Margaret stood just behind the threshold of her porch, neither stepping forward nor retreating, her presence quiet but undeniable, because whatever this moment was, it did not belong to one side or the other, it belonged to what had already been set in motion. Sheriff Crow's eyes moved slowly across the line of riders, counting, measuring, calculating something that could not be solved with numbers alone. And when his gaze finally settled on Margaret, there was something different in it. Not anger, not accusation, but something closer to uncertainty, as if the ground beneath his understanding had shifted without warning. "You knew this would happen," he said, his voice carrying across the distance, not raised, but firm, and Margaret held his gaze without flinching. "I knew they were hungry," she replied. The same words once more, unchanged, unadorned, and for a brief moment, the sheriff said nothing, his jaw tightening slightly as if he had expected something else, something easier to answer, something that fit within the lines he had drawn. The man across from him did not interrupt, did not assert. He simply waited, his presence steady, allowing the space to hold its own weight. And behind him, the riders remained as they were, not shifting, not reacting, their silence speaking in a way words could not. Sheriff Crow exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the open air, and his gaze moved again, this time taking in not just the number of riders, but the way they stood, the lack of hostility, the absence of threat, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but real, as if he was beginning to see not what he had expected, but what was actually there. "They have not crossed your fence," he said after a moment, more to himself than to anyone else. And Margaret glanced briefly toward the line, noting the truth of it, the invisible boundary of her land untouched, respected in a way that did not need to be enforced. "No," she answered quietly, "they have not." The sheriff nodded once, a small, restrained motion, and for the first time since arriving, he did not look like a man giving orders. He looked like a man standing in front of something he had not prepared for, something that did not fit the shape of the world he thought he understood, and the silence returned, deeper now, more settled, as if the land itself was waiting to see what would be done with it, and Margaret stood there, the turquoise resting in her palm, knowing without needing to say it that whatever came next would not be decided by force, but by what each man chose to see in the quiet before them. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something turning beneath the surface where no one could see it, and the man at the center of the riders finally moved his horse one step closer, not enough to close the distance, only enough to speak without raising his voice. And when he did, it was not directed at Margaret, but at Sheriff Crow, as if the truth now belonged to the space between them all. "Those men who came to her yesterday were not wandering," he said, his tone even, measured, carrying no edge. "They were carrying words meant to prevent what you see here today," and the sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if he was choosing carefully what to hear and what to dismiss. "Prevent what, exactly?" he asked, and there was a weight behind the question, the kind that comes when a man senses that the answer may reach further than he is prepared to follow. The rider did not rush, did not press. He simply let the question settle before answering. "They were sent to speak with you," he said, "to ask for passage, to ask that your men not follow our people further south this season." And the words hung in the air, quiet, undeniable, and Margaret saw the moment something shifted behind the sheriff's eyes, not a reaction, not yet, but a recognition that something had been missed, something that had passed close enough to touch, but had gone unseen. "You expect me to believe that," Crow said after a moment. Though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Three riders show up half-starved, and you call that diplomacy?" And the man inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding. "Hunger does not erase purpose," he replied. "It reveals it." And the simplicity of the statement carried further than any argument could have. Margaret remained still, her gaze moving between them, not intervening, not guiding, because this was no longer about her choice. It was about what had been set in motion long before those riders reached her land. They did not reach the town, the man continued, his eyes steady on the sheriff, because they were turned away before they could speak, and for the first time, Sheriff Crow looked away, just briefly, his gaze shifting toward the men behind him, as if measuring what they had seen, what they had allowed. And in that small movement, something quiet gave way, not a collapse, not an admission, but a space where certainty no longer held as tightly as it had before. "They were warned off," one of the men behind him said under his breath, not loud enough to challenge, but loud enough to exist, and the sheriff did not silence him, did not correct him. He simply absorbed it, standing there in the open, with no cover but his own judgment. The man at the center of the riders continued, not pressing, not accusing, just laying each piece where it belonged. "They came here because she did not turn them away," he said, his voice shifting slightly, not softer, but carrying something closer to acknowledgement. "She gave them food, and because of that, they were able to continue, to reach those who needed to hear what they carried." And Margaret felt the weight of that truth settle into her, not as pride, not as surprise, but as something steady, something that did not need to be claimed to be understood. Sheriff Crow exhaled slowly, the sound quieter now, less like resistance and more like release. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not weaker, but less certain of where it stood. "So you are saying this, all of this," he gestured slightly toward the line of riders, "not as a threat, but as something larger than himself, is not here to make a point. It is here because of what was carried forward." And the man nodded once, simple, direct. "It is here because a door was not closed." The words settled deeper than before, and the sheriff's gaze moved back to Margaret, standing on her porch with the morning light behind her, the small piece of turquoise still resting in her hand. And for a moment, there was no judgment in his eyes, no command, only a quiet recalculation of something he had believed to be fixed. The land remained still around them, the riders holding their line, the town men holding theirs, and between them stood something neither side had expected, something that had not been built with force or demand, but with a single choice made without witness, without reward. And as the weight of that choice unfolded in the open air, it became clear that what stood before them was not a confrontation, but a consequence none of them had fully understood until now. No one moved right away, not the riders, not the men from town, not even the wind. And in that stillness, something quiet settled over the land, something that did not belong to either side but held them both in place, as if the moment itself was asking to be understood before it was allowed to pass. Sheriff Crow remained where he was, his hands resting loosely near the reins, his posture no longer rigid, no longer set against what stood before him. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried less weight of authority and more of something harder to define, something closer to acceptance than command. "Then there is nothing to answer for here," he said, not loudly, not as a declaration, but as a conclusion reached in full view of everyone present. The man at the center of the riders inclined his head once, a simple acknowledgement, and behind him, the line remained unchanged, not pressing forward, not easing back, holding their place as if waiting for something more than words to confirm what had already been understood. Margaret stood on the edge of her porch, the morning light now fully settled across her land, warming the dry soil, touching the fence, the barn, the small house that had seen more years of silence than most men could bear, and in her hand, the piece of turquoise felt different now, not heavier, not lighter, just complete, as if whatever it had been meant to carry had reached its end. Sheriff Crow glanced once more across the wide arc of riders, then back toward Margaret, and for a moment, the look he gave her was not one of judgment or warning, but something quieter, something that did not ask for explanation because it had already found its own, and without another word, he turned his horse, the movement slow, deliberate, not hurried, not reluctant, simply decided, and the men behind him followed, one by one, their departure as measured as their arrival, leaving the space they had filled without disturbance, without sound beyond the steady rhythm of hooves returning to the road they had come from. The land did not change when they left. It remained as it had been, open, still, carrying the presence of what had just passed through it. And for a few moments more, the riders remained where they were, their line unbroken, their silence intact, as if giving the moment time to settle fully before allowing it to move on. Then, just as quietly as they had arrived, the man at the center shifted his reins slightly, turning his horse with a motion so small it barely disturbed the air, and one by one, the riders followed, not in haste, not in retreat, but in the same steady rhythm that had brought them there, their figures moving away from the land, spreading out across the horizon until they became part of it once more, leaving behind no mark but the memory of their presence. Margaret watched them go without stepping forward, without calling out, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, because there was nothing left to ask, nothing left to hold on to. The exchange had already been made in full, long before the first rider appeared at her fence. When the last figure disappeared beyond the rise, the silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It carried something within it now, something that did not fade when the land grew quiet again, and Margaret turned slowly, stepping back onto her porch, the boards creaking softly beneath her weight as they always had, and she walked inside, leaving the door open behind her. The house welcomed her with the same stillness it had held for years, the same light falling across the table, and she crossed the room without pause, setting the piece of turquoise back where it had been, not hidden, not set aside, simply placed where it could remain as it was, a small thing that had carried something far larger than itself. Outside, the wind moved again, gentle, familiar, brushing against the fields, the fence, the barn, and Margaret stood for a moment by the window, her gaze drifting across the land that was once again her own, unchanged in shape, unchanged in size, and yet not the same as it had been the day before. She reached for the cloth on the table, unfolding it with practiced hands, and began to prepare what little she had left, not because anyone was coming, not because she expected anything in return, but because it was what she did, what she had always done, and as the morning settled into its quiet rhythm, the land held no trace of what had passed through it except for one simple truth. Out here, a door left open could travel farther than any man on horseback, and sometimes it returned not with noise or force, but with something that stood beside you in silence, long enough for the world to remember what it had forgotten.